Islam is one of the major religions in the world, and we all know that this religion has beautiful, intriguing, and somewhat bloody history. But today, we will not talk about Islam religion, but to the people behind it. Muslim was the term given for the people who follow and practice the Islam teachings. According to the World Population Review as of 2020, there is an approximately 1.9 billion Muslims around the globe, making Islam the second largest religion in the world behind Christianity. The Islam population is mainly split between 1.5 billion Sunni Muslims and 200 to 340 million Shia Muslims, with other belongs to smaller denominations. The largest country is Indonesia. There is an estimated 229 million Muslims residing in the country. But before this current data, Muslim people already have hundreds of thousands of followers residing in West Asia, North of Africa, and some part of Europe, given the date from 1450 to 1800s. In this chapter, we will tackle three Muslim empires, the Ottoman, the Safavid, and the Mughal Empire. We will try to find out how did these empires began, expand, and prosper, and what are the arts and architecture they left to us. And just like any other empires, how did these empires decline or somewhat disappear? Good day everyone, I am Arnel L. Baksa from the Bachelor of Secondary Education, major in Social Studies 3D, and this is Chapter 5, the Muslim Empire. Here is the timeline of the Muslim Empire from 1450s until 1800s. As you can see, it all began in 1453 when the Ottoman Turks captured the Constantinople, a strong-walled capital city in the Byzantine Empire. And as you notice in the middle section of the timeline, the Safavid Empire reached its peak of glory in 1600s, and the timeline ended in 1757 when British defeated the Mughal Empire in the Battle of Plassey. Together with the timeline, we have some arts and artifacts, and the two greatest and grandest architectural contributions of the Muslim Empire, the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople or in the modern-day Turkey, and the Taj Mahal located in India, both built in the height of success of the Muslim Empire. With this, let's get started. In the late 13th century, a new group of Turks under the leader Osman began to build power in the northwest corner of the Anatolian Peninsula. That land was given to them by the Seljuk Turk rulers as a gift or as a reward for helping them to defend their lands against the Mongols in the late 13th century. At first, the Osman Turks or the Ottoman Turks were relatively peaceful and engaged in pastoral activities. As the Seljuk Empire began to decline in the early 14th century, the Osman Turks began to expand, and this was the beginning of the Ottoman dynasty. From their location in the northwestern corner of the peninsula, the Ottomans expanded westward and eventually controlled the Bosporus and Dardanelles. These two straits, separated by the Sea of Marmara, connect the Black Sea and the Aegean Sea, which leads to the Mediterranean. The Byzantine Empire had controlled this area for centuries, and in 14th century, the Ottoman Turks expanded into the Balkans. Ottoman rulers claimed the title of Sultan and began to build a strong military by developing an elite guard called Janissaries, recruited from the Christian population of the Balkans. These Janissaries were converted to Islam. Some are willing to convert, but some are forced to convert to Islam and trained as foot soldiers or administrators to serve the Sultan. As knowledge of firearms spread in the late 14th century, the Ottomans began to master the new technology. The Janissaries, trained as a well-armed infantry, began to spread Ottoman control in the Balkans. With their new forces, the Ottomans defeated the Serbs at the Battle of Kosovo in 1389. They advanced northward and reached Bulgaria. Over the next 300 years, Ottoman rule expanded in large areas in Western Asia, as well as North Africa and some parts of Europe. We have here the fall of Constantinople. Under the leadership of Mehmet II, the Ottomans moved to end the Byzantine Empire. With 80,000 troops ranged against only 7,000 defenders, Mehmet II laid siege to Constantinople. During their attack on the city, the Ottomans used massive cannons with 26-foot barrels that could launch stone balls weighing up to 1,200 pounds. The attack began on April 6, 1453, with an Ottoman bombardment. The Byzantines took their final stand behind the walls along the western edge of the city. They fought desperately for almost 2 months to save their city. Finally, on May 29, the walls were breached. The Ottoman soldiers poured into the city. The Byzantine emperor died in the final battle, and a great 3-day sack of the city began. When Mehmet II saw the ruin and destruction of the city, he was filled with regret and actually says, "What a city we have given over the plunder and destruction." Western Asia and Africa. With their new capital at Constantinople, the Ottoman Turks now dominated the Balkans and the Anatolian Peninsula. From approximately 1514 to 1517, Sultan Selim I took control of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Arabia, which is the original heartland of Islam, controlling several of the holy cities of Islam, including Jerusalem, Mecca, and Medina. Selim I declared himself as the new Caliph, defender of faith, and successor of Muhammad. After their victories in the east, Ottoman forces spent the next few years advancing westward along the African coast, eventually almost reaching the Strait of Gibraltar. The impact of Ottoman rule on the people of North Africa was relatively light. However, the Ottomans were Muslims. Possibly, they preferred to administer the conquered lands through local rulers. The central government appointed officials, called pashas, who collected taxes, maintained law and order, and were directly responsible to the Sultan's court in Constantinople. Now we have Europe. After their conquest of Constantinople in 1453, Ottoman Turks tried to complete their conquest of the Balkans. No? They took the Romanian territory of Wallachia, but the Hungarians stopped their advancement. The reign of Suleiman I, also called the Suleiman Magnificent, beginning in 1520, led to new attacks on Europe. First, the Ottomans seized Belgrade, then in 1526 at the Battle of the Mohawks on the Danube. They won a major victory over the Hungarians. The Ottomans then conquered most of Hungary, moved into Austria, and advanced as far as Vienna. They were finally defeated in 1529. At the same time, they extended their power into the western Mediterranean until a large Ottoman fleet was defeated by the Spaniards or by the Spanish at the Battle of Lepanto in 1571. During the first half of the 17th century of the Ottoman Empire in Eastern Europe, no, remained a sleeping giant. They are considered as sleeping giant. Why? Because they remain silent. There is no siege happens, and they're occupied with internal problems. However, in the second half of the 17th century, they again went on the offensive. Now they want to conquer more of Europe. By the mid 1683, the Ottomans had marched through the Hungarian plain and laid siege to Vienna. But they were defeated by the big army of Europeans. No, the Ottomans were retreated and were pushed out of Hungary. Although they retained the core of their empire, meaning they still have Constantinople and other lands, and some West Asian countries were fierce with them, the Ottoman Turks would never again be a threat to Central Europe. Like the other Muslim emperors in Persia and in India, the Ottoman Empire is often labeled as Gunpowder Empire. As the name suggests, this is the term given for an empire who largely based its mastery of technology of firearms to its success. The head of Ottoman Empire or the Ottoman system was of course the Sultan. The Sultan who was the supreme authority in both political and military sense. The position of Sultan was of course hereditary. The son, which is not necessarily the eldest, no, can be the successor of the Sultan. As the empire expanded, the status and prestige of the Sultan increased. and the position took on the trappings of imperial rule. A centralized administrative system was adopted, and the Sultan became increasingly isolated to his palace. The Topkapi, or the Iron Gate Palace in Constantinople, was the center of the Sultan's power. The palace was built in the 15th century by Mehmet II. It had an administrative purposes and served as the private place or residence of the ruler and his family. The private domain or the private room of the Sultan was called harem or the sacred place. Here, the Sultan and his wives resided. Often, a Sultan can choose 4 to 5 wives, and those are his favorites. No? When a son became a Sultan, his mother can be called the Queen Mother. And the Queen Mother can acted as the major advisor of the throne. The tradition often give considerably power to the queen in the affairs of state. The Sultan controlled his bureaucracy through imperial council that he met for 4 times a day. A chief minister known as the Grand Vizier led the meetings of the council. Then the Sultan will just sat behind on the screen, no, and privately indicated his desires to the Grand Vizier. The empire was divided into provinces and districts, each governed by officials. They were assisted by bureaucrats who had been trained in a school for officials. Senior officials were given land by the Sultan, and they were the responsible for collecting taxes and maintaining law and order, and of course supplying goods for the armies for the empire from this landed area. Now, let's talk the religion of the Ottoman world. Just like any other Turkish-speaking peoples in Anatolian Peninsula and throughout Western Asia, the Ottomans are Sunni Muslims. Ottoman sultans had claimed the title Caliph since the early 16th century. In theory, they believed that the Caliph was the responsible for guiding the flock or the Muslim people and maintaining the Islamic law. The sultans gave a religious duties to a group called ulema. These are religious advisors. This group administered the legal system and schools for educating Muslims. Islamic law and customs were applied to all Muslims in the empire. But the good thing here for the Ottoman Empire, no, they are very generally tolerant for the non-Muslims who made up a significant minority in the empire. Non-Muslims paid tax just like any other people inside the empire, but they were allowed to practice their religion or to convert to Islam. Most people in European areas of the empire remain Christian, but in some cases, just like the modern day Bosnia, large numbers of people there converted to Islamic faith. Now let's talk about the Ottoman society. So aside from the Sultan, aside from his family and other elite groups in the Ottoman Empire, we still have four main occupational groups inside the empire. First, we have the peasants, then the artisans, then the merchants, and lastly, the pastoral people. The peasants farmed land, and those lands are leased by them from the state or the government because all land in Ottoman Empire was owned by the Sultan. Next, we have the artisans. Artisans were organized or according to craft guilds. Each guild provided financial services to social security and training to its members. Outside the ruling elite, we have the merchants, and merchants are were the most privileged class in the Ottoman society. They were largely exempted from any government regulations and taxes, and they were able to own and amass large fortunes. And lastly, we have the pastoral people. These are nomadic herders, meaning they are placed in separate group with their own regulations and laws. And in Ottoman Empire, women were subject to the same restrictions as women in other Muslim societies. Meaning, they treat women just like how other Muslim people treat women in their own society. But in their position in the empire, Ottoman Empire, was somewhat better. As applied in the Ottoman Empire, Islamic law was more tolerant in defining the legal position of women. This is maybe because it was based on the traditions of the Turkish people, because Turkish people believe that their men are equal to women. Women are allowed to own and inherit property. They could not be forced to get married, or to get marriage to person they don't like. And in some cases, they are able to seek divorce. And women often gain considerable power inside the palace, meaning they have their own position in the palace. In some instances, women even serve as senior officials, such as governors and leaders of any district and provinces. So what are the problems in the Ottoman Empire? The Ottoman Empire reached its high point under Suleiman the Magnificent, who ruled from 1520 to 1566. It may also have been during Suleiman's when the problems began to occur. However, having executed his two most able sons on suspicion of treason, Suleiman was succeeded by his only surviving son, which is Selim II. The problems of the Ottoman Empire did not become visible until 1699, when the empire began to lose some of its territory. However, the signs of internal disintegration, meaning inside the empire or means inside the Constantinople, had already appeared at the beginning of the 1600s. After the death of Suleiman, sultans became less involved in the government. Those successors of Suleiman became less involved in the government, and they allowed their ministers, just like the Grand Vizier, to exercise more political power than them. The training of officials declined, so those senior positions left are assigned from the son or daughters of the elite. Members of the central bureaucracy lost its links with the rural areas, meaning the leader, the sultan, lost its connection on its people outside the Constantinople. So what happened here is the results of officials grew corrupt. The local officials grew corrupt, and the tax rose, meaning they increased the taxes of the people. Constant wars also was depleted the internal treasury. Corruption and in palace intrigue grew. Another sign of change within the empire was the exchange of Western and Ottoman ideas and customs. Officials and merchants began to imitate the European way of life, meaning they imitate the habits and lifestyle of the Europeans. They wore European clothes, they bought Western furnitures, European jewelries and objects, no, and arts. During the 16th and 17th centuries, coffee also is introduced to Ottoman society and spread to, all throughout Europe and Ottoman Empire. With this, some sultans attempted to counter this stress. Of course, they don't want to lose their own identity. So, one sultan in the early 17th century issued a decree outlawing or even banned coffee and tobacco in the Ottoman Empire. He even began to patrol the streets of Constantinople at night. And if he caught some subjects of immoral or illegal acts, or some people who practice European ways of lifestyle, he had them immediately executed. Not just put in jail, but immediately executed. The Ottoman sultans were enthusiastic patrons of the arts. The period from Mehmet II to the early 18th century witnessed a flourishing production of pottery, rugs, silk, and other textiles. They also have jewelry, arms, and armor. All of these adorned the palaces of the rulers. Artists came from all over the world to compete for the generous rewards of the sultans. By far, the greatest contribution of the Ottoman Empire was the architecture, especially the magnificent mosque of the last half of the 16th century. The Ottoman Turks modeled their mosque on the open floor plan of the Constantinople's Byzantine church, which is the Hagia Sophia, creating a prayer hall with an open central area under one large dome. In the mid 16th century, the greatest of all Ottoman architects, namely Sinan, began building his first of his 81 mosques. One of the Sinan's masterpieces and the greatest contribution of Ottoman Empire was the Süleymaniye Mosque in Istanbul. Each of his mosques was topped by an opposing dome, and often the entire building was framed with four towers or cold minarets. The 16th century also witnessed the flourishing of textiles and rugs. The Byzantine Emperor Justinian had introduced silk cultivation to the West in the 6th century. Under the Ottomans, the silk industry resurfaced. Factories produced silks for the wall hangings, sofa covers, and especially court costumes. Rugs were an peasant industry. The rugs, made of wool and cotton in villages from different regions, each boasted their own distinctive designs and color schemes.